After leading the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, Jimmy Doolittle crash-landed in China, then went right back into the skies. He faced crash after crash, mission after mission, and never stopped. If resilience had a face, it would be his. Share this story and stay tuned for more unstoppable legends of WW2. High in the tangled hills of northeast India, where the jungles breathe mist and the roads curve like serpents around green ridges, a small town named Kohima sits quietly between worlds. In 1944, it was little more than a dot on the map, a few houses, a church, a district commissioner's bungalow, and a tennis court carved into the hillside. It was a peaceful outpost in the shadow of an empire, until the war came crawling up the mountain. For years, the war in the east had raged far from here, across Burma, in jungles where men vanished and armies dissolved in rain. The Japanese had swept across Southeast Asia with terrifying speed, seizing Singapore, Malaya, and Burma. The British Empire, humiliated and pushed back, clung now to India, its last great bastion in the east. But in 1944, Japan decided to strike at that heart. The plan, code-named Operation Yugo, was bold and insane in equal measure. The Japanese 15th Army, under General Renya Mutaguchi, would cross the jungle-choked mountains of Burma and invade India itself. The goal, seize the strategic cities of Imphal and Kohima, cut the Allied supply lines, and ignite a nationalist revolt that would topple British rule. Mutaguchi promised Tokyo that the liberation of India would be swift. He had no idea the jungle would become his army's grave. Kohima was not a fortress. It was a small ridge with a road, the only route between Dimapur, the supply hub in the plains, and Imphal, where the main British forces were stationed. That single road was the lifeline for thousands of Allied troops. If Kohima fell, Imphal would be cut off and starved. The Japanese knew it. The British knew it. And so, this quiet hill town became the hinge of an empire. By early April 1944, Kohima's defenders were few, a handful of British and Indian soldiers, some local Naga tribesmen, and scattered reinforcements trickling up the twisting road from Dimapur. They were outnumbered nearly 10-1 by the advancing Japanese. The garrison was commanded by Colonel Hugh Richards, a calm, unflappable officer who understood what was coming. His men dug trenches along the ridge, turned the tennis court into a killing ground, and waited. Then the jungle erupted. The Japanese came silently at first, shadows moving through bamboo and fog. They struck on April 4. Mortars screamed out of the trees, shells tore through wooden walls, and by nightfall, the defenders were surrounded. The siege of Kohima had begun. At first light, the defenders saw them, hundreds of Japanese soldiers crawling up the slopes, bayonets glinting in the pale dawn. They were veterans of Burma, hardened and disciplined. Their commander, General Kutoku Soto, believed in victory through willpower. His men carried little food, expecting to live off captured supplies. They thought Kohima would fall in days. But the ridge refused to break. The defenders fought from trenches and bunkers so close to the enemy that grenades and bayonets became the weapons of choice. Every inch of ground was contested, every tree, every wall. The tennis court, once a symbol of colonial leisure, became a line between life and death. The Japanese held one side. The British held the other. The white boundary line still cut through the dirt between them, lit by the flash of gunfire. By night, the jungle was alive with sound, the cries of the wounded, the buzz of insects, the whisper of movement in the dark. Supplies dwindled. Men fought over water. Casualties mounted. When shells ran out, they fought with knives. When knives broke, with their hands. The siege ground on day after day, week after week, through hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. For the Japanese, the dream of swift victory faded as the monsoon approached. Their supply lines stretched across mountains and swamps. Starvation crept in. Yet still, they pressed the attack, believing that sheer will could conquer nature, terrain, and flesh. The British, cut off and low on ammunition, called for air drops. Dakotas and hurricanes roared overhead, braving Japanese fire to drop supplies into the encircled ridge. Some landed in enemy lines, others in the mud. Men scrambled under fire to retrieve them, dragging tins of food and crates of bullets back to their trenches. Every ration saved was another hour of survival. By mid-April, Kohima had become hell. The air stank of decay and cordite. The dead lay where they fell, too dangerous to bury. Both sides dug in so close that they could hear each other breathe through the walls of the trenches. At night, voices drifted between lines, in English, in Japanese, in whispers. One British soldier wrote in his diary, "The enemy is 10 yards away. We can smell them." And through it all, the tennis court stood, scarred, cratered, soaked in rain and blood. Its net post splintered by bullets. The white chalk lines now trenches. The small patch of earth became one of the most fought over spaces in the entire war. The Japanese charged it again and again. The British refused to yield. By the third week, Kohima was a name whispered in command tents hundreds of miles away, a desperate fight for survival on a ridge no one had heard of. The British 14th Army, under General William Slim, knew the stakes. If Kohima fell, the road to Imphal would collapse, and India might follow. Slim ordered reinforcements to break through from Dimapur. But the road was narrow, the jungle thick, and the Japanese everywhere. Every mile had to be fought for. In those weeks, Kohima became a microcosm of the entire war in the East, brutal, personal, fought not over grand ideals but over inches of ground and the will to stand one more day. It was not the war of parades or medals. It was the war of mud, rain, hunger, and endurance. The defenders' wireless operators sent their final message before their batteries died, still holding. Situation critical. Then silence. The siege deepens. By the second week of April 1944, Kohima has become a wound carved into the side of a mountain. Every morning begins with the thud of mortars, every night with the rattle of machine gun fire echoing through mist and rain. The ridge is so small that shells overshoot one trench and fall into another. There is nowhere safe. The wounded lie side by side with the living. There are no rear lines, no hospitals, only shallow pits and the will to endure. Colonel Richards keeps his men alive through routine, ration counts, watch rotations, whispered orders. He knows that discipline, not bravado, will save them. He walks the trenches with a calmness that hides exhaustion, encouraging men who haven't slept in days. "Hold until relief comes," he says. But the men have stopped believing in relief. They fight because they have no other choice. The Japanese tighten the noose. From the surrounding hills, they pour fire down on the British positions, cutting off every approach. Snipers pick off anyone who moves above the parapet. The ridge is so narrow that the defenders can only dig shallow trenches a few feet deep before hitting rock. Men crouch in the mud, counting grenades, measuring each bullet like gold. And yet, amid the horror, a strange rhythm takes hold, an unspoken duel between two armies separated by yards of earth. The British know the Japanese are starving, the Japanese know the British are exhausted. They listen to each other's voices through the night, the coughs, the murmurs, the rattle of tin cups. The lines blur. Once, during a lull, a British soldier tosses a cigarette across the tennis court. Minutes later, one lands back. No words. Just a brief exchange of humanity before the killing resumes. By mid-April, reinforcements from the British 2nd Division begin their push up the Dimapur Road, the only artery into Kohima. The terrain is a nightmare, steep, slick, and mined. Japanese ambushes lie in wait behind every curve. For every yard gained, another man falls. But they push on, knowing what's at stake. Imphal is still under siege to the south. If Kohima collapses, the two fronts will merge, and the Japanese will hold the high ground. The Allies cannot let that happen. In the trenches, food runs out. Water is scarce. Men drink rain caught in helmets, eat from the dead when the ration drops fail. The Japanese, too, are starving. They had crossed the mountains with only weeks of supplies, expecting victory to feed them. Now, their rice is gone. They eat roots, leaves, anything that grows. Disease spreads faster than bullets. Yet still, they fight on, driven by duty, by pride, by orders they can no longer question. Each day, the tennis court sees blood. The defenders crawl through shell holes, dragging wounded comrades out by their belts. The Japanese charge through smoke, their bayonets fixed, shouting battle cries that echo off the hills. Sometimes they reach the British trenches, and the fight collapses into chaos of knives, shovels, fists. The mud is slick with blood and rain. The air reeks of cordite and decay. At night, the rain drums on helmets and tin roofs. The fireflies glow like traces in the mist. The men write letters they will never send. One private writes, "It's hard to believe this is the same world we came from. The jungle eats everything, trees, men, time." Then, on April 18th, the sound changes. From the north comes the distant thunder of artillery, not Japanese, but British. Relief is near. The 2nd Division has broken through the outer defenses and is fighting its way toward the ridge. But for the men inside Kohima, it might as well be miles away. They are too weak to cheer. Some are too weak to lift their rifles. The next morning, the Japanese attack again. It is their fiercest assault yet, hundreds of men charging through the trees, screaming, firing, hurling grenades. The defenders unleash everything they have left. The tennis court becomes a storm of fire and steel. Smoke rolls across the ridge, blotting out the sun. The air is so thick with dust that men can hardly breathe. When the attack finally breaks, the court is unrecognizable, craters where there were once lines, corpses where there were once players. Both sides are shattered. But the ridge still holds. 2 days later, the first British reinforcements reach the outskirts of Kohima. The relief column claws its way up the final slopes under sniper fire, dragging artillery through mud so deep it swallows men whole. When they finally reach the garrison, what they find is barely human, gaunt faces, hollow eyes, uniforms in tatters. The survivors are too stunned to speak. The rescuers, too, stand silent. The smell of death hangs over everything. Colonel Richards greets the incoming troops with a simple nod. His men have held the line for 16 days against overwhelming odds. The siege is broken, but the battle is far from over. The Japanese have dug into the surrounding hills, and every ridge, every trench must now be retaken by hand. The fight for Kohima becomes a reversal. The besieged now become the attackers. The British and Indian troops begin to claw back the ground they lost, inch by inch. The Japanese, weakened but fanatically disciplined, refuse to retreat. Every tree becomes a bunker, every ravine a trap. The monsoon breaks overhead, turning the battlefield into a river of mud. The wounded drown where they lie. Yet still, the killing goes on. Through April and into May, the hills of Kohima burn. The British 2nd Division, alongside Indian units and Naga scouts, push forward relentlessly. The Japanese lines crumble slowly, their morale breaking under starvation and the weight of constant shelling. Those who survive begin to understand what Mutaguchi's ambition has cost them. There will be no glorious victory. No liberation of India. Only hunger, death, and retreat. But retreat, to the Japanese soldier, is unthinkable. They fight on even as their officers die, even as ammunition runs out. Some charge with bayonets. Others with bamboo spears. The madness of it burns into the memories of all who witness it. By early May, the Allied artillery has reduced the Japanese positions to ruins. The tennis court, that small rectangle of earth that has come to symbolize the entire battle, changes hands 3 times in one day. When it is finally secured, there is nothing left to take. The surviving defenders of Kohima stand at the edge of the ridge, staring down at the valley below, where the jungle sways gently as if nothing ever happened. The cost of holding this hill, of defending this single patch of ground, will echo for decades. The Japanese dead number in the thousands. The Allied casualties, too, are staggering. Yet, strategically, something has shifted. For the first time in the war, Japan's advance in Asia has been stopped cold. Kohima is the hinge on which the campaign turns. And in the ruined court, among the craters and shattered rackets, someone finds a bull, scuffed, blackened, still faintly white beneath the soot. A relic of another world, now buried beneath the weight of history. When the smoke cleared from Kohima Ridge, the survivors looked down upon a landscape that no longer resembled the earth. Hills once covered in green were stripped bare, trees shredded into splinters, the ground cratered and black. The smell of cordite mixed with decay, and the silence that followed was heavier than any bombardment. The Battle of Kohima was over, but the war in Burma was not. Word spread through the Allied lines, Kohima holds. It was more than a victory. It was proof that the Japanese could be stopped. For months, their armies had seemed invincible, sweeping across Southeast Asia, taking Singapore, Malaya, and Burma itself. Their dream of marching into India, the jewel of the British Empire, now lay shattered in the mud. But for the men who had fought here, that triumph came at a terrible cost. Entire battalions were gone. Units were so depleted that they could no longer fight as cohesive forces. Yet, the order came down: push south, link up with Imphal, and crush the Japanese invasion once and for all. The counteroffensive began in May 1944. Rain fell in sheets, and the roads turned to rivers. Convoys bogged down axle-deep in mud, mules drowned in swollen streams, and supply trucks sank without a trace. The men advanced through this misery, British, Indian, African troops, side by side, their boots rotting, their uniforms stiff with grime. The Japanese, retreating now through jungle and swamp, left behind only broken weapons and their dead. For the Japanese 31st Division, which had besieged Kohima, the retreat was a death march. Starvation became their greatest enemy. Their supply lines, already fragile, had collapsed entirely. The rice they had counted on from captured depots never came. Many resorted to eating grass, snakes, and the bodies of fallen comrades. The dream of glory had turned into horror. Those who had marched with banners now crawled barefoot through mud, haunted by disease and hunger. General Mutaguchi, the architect of the Yugo offensive, the grand plan to invade India, refused to accept defeat. Even as his army disintegrated, he demanded they fight on. Officers wept as they read his orders. They knew there was nothing left to fight with. But the Japanese soldier, bound by duty and the code of Bushido, obeyed. Some units were reduced to a handful of men. Entire companies vanished into the jungle, never to be seen again. Meanwhile, at Imphal, the Allied garrison had endured its own nightmare. Surrounded for months, they had fought off relentless attacks while waiting for relief. Food and ammunition were flown in by air, and the wounded were evacuated under fire. Pilots risked their lives landing on muddy airstrips in monsoon storms. When news came that Kohima had been relieved, the men at Imphal knew the tide was turning. By late May, the road between Kohima and Imphal, once cut off by Japanese forces, was open again. The reunion of the two garrisons was one of the most emotional moments of the Burma campaign. Soldiers from Kohima, gaunt and hollow-eyed, embraced those from Imphal who looked just as broken. Together, they had held the line against one of the most determined offensives of the war. One Indian officer wrote in his diary, "We have lived through the darkest valley and seen the sun again. But we shall never be the same men." As the Allies advanced, they began to witness the full scale of Japanese suffering. Bodies lined the roads, men who had simply lain down and never risen again. Abandoned weapons, rusted helmets, diaries written in trembling script. Some pages described starvation in agonizing detail. Others were prayers. The jungle became a graveyard stretching for miles. For the British and Indian forces, the victory was more than strategic, it was psychological. Kohima and Imphal had proven that the Japanese army, once feared for its ferocity, could be beaten in the field. The myth of their invincibility was broken. But no one who had fought there saw it as glory. They saw it as survival, nothing more, nothing less. In London, Winston Churchill called the victory the greatest ever won by the British Army. He was not exaggerating. It was the turning point of the entire Burma campaign, and perhaps the most important battle fought on Indian soil during the Second World War. From this moment, the Allies would go on the offensive, retaking Burma, pushing toward Rangoon, and eventually driving Japan's empire into retreat. But for the men who had stood on Kohima Ridge, those grand victories meant little. They remembered the faces of their friends, the smell of rain and blood, the sight of the tennis court turned into a cratered hell. In the years after the war, survivors returned to Kohima to find the jungle had reclaimed everything. The trenches were gone, the court overgrown with moss. Yet one part remained untouched, the small cemetery on the ridge where more than 1,400 Allied soldiers were buried. At its entrance stands an epitaph, simple and devastating: "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today." That single line captures everything that Kohima was, not a story of conquest, but of endurance. Of ordinary men holding on in impossible conditions, in a place few had heard of, for a cause that seemed far away. And in that forgotten corner of the world, high in the Burmese hills, the fate of Asia turned, not because of grand strategy, but because a handful of exhausted men refused to yield. Years later, when the jungles of Burma had swallowed the scars of war, few outside the veteran circles remembered the name Kohima. It did not have the fame of Normandy, the drama of Dunkirk, or the tragedy of Stalingrad. It was a battle fought far from the cameras, in a place most people couldn't find on a map. Yet historians would come to call it the Stalingrad of the East. For those who fought there, the memories never left. They spoke of the sound of rain on tin helmets, of letters written by candlelight, of the smell of mud that never seemed to wash away. Some could still hear the distant shouts of the Japanese charging across the tennis court, others remembered the silence afterward, the silence of men who had seen too much. The survivors returned home to a Britain weary of war. Many found no one wanted to hear about Burma. Europe's battles took the headlines: D-Day, Arnhem, Berlin. Kohima was a footnote. One veteran said, "When I told people where I fought, they'd ask, 'Where's that?' And I'd just say, 'Somewhere between hell and nowhere.'" But in India and Burma, the memory lived on. The Nagas, whose villages had stood between two armies, rebuilt their homes from the ruins. They remembered the soldiers who had shared their food, who had fought and died on their land. The tennis court was leveled, the graves tended. Each spring, the hill blooms with orchids, and the white headstones shine through the grass-like bones of a vanished army. Strategically, the battle changed everything. After Kohima and Imphal, the Japanese never again advanced into India. Their army in Burma began to crumble, hunted through jungle and plain until the last remnant surrendered in 1945. The British 14th Army, once dismissed as the Forgotten Army, had achieved one of the most decisive victories of the war. But the cost was staggering: tens of thousands dead, many more wounded or lost to disease. In Tokyo, General Mutaguchi refused to believe his offensive had failed until it was too late. His soldiers had marched into the mountains full of pride, only a handful staggered back. Some historians say his arrogance destroyed an entire army. Others say his men's sacrifice, futile as it was, showed the terrifying resolve of Japan's military spirit. But either way, the jungles of Kohima became their grave. In later years, a few Japanese veterans returned. One stood before the memorial stone, bowed deeply, and said, "We were enemies, but we were all soldiers. This place belongs to us both." His words carried the quiet dignity of men who had seen war's madness and survived to regret it. Today, the Kohima War Cemetery remains one of the most haunting sights in Asia. Visitors walk among rows of headstones carved with names from every corner of the British Empire: Englishmen, Scots, Indians, Gurkhas, Africans, all side by side, equal in death. Above them, carved into stone, the words endure: "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today." That line, written by John Maxwell Edmonds and chosen by the survivors themselves, has become the voice of Kohima, a whisper from the dead to the living, reminding the world that freedom was not won in great capitals or famous beaches, but sometimes on a muddy hill over a forgotten tennis court. Kohima was not about conquest or glory. It was about men who refused to yield, who fought not because they wanted to, but because they had to. It was about a ridge that held when the world seemed to be collapsing, and about a moment when the course of history turned, quietly, painfully, irrevocably. And so, when you think of World War II, of the beaches of Normandy, the skies over Britain, or the ruins of Berlin, remember the hills of Burma too. Remember the rain, the mud, and the courage of those who fought in silence. Because sometimes, the greatest battles are the ones the world forgets. The Battle of Kohima wasn't fought for fame, it was fought for survival. A ridge, a tennis court, a handful of men who refused to break. And their stand changed the war in Asia forever. If you believe their story deserves to be remembered, share it, and subscribe to the channel for WW2 files. Because history only lives on when we tell it.